What is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Sean Jones NBA Show. I know it has been a while. I like to take my time to, catch a breather after the playoffs and the early busy parts of the offseason. So I know it's been a couple months, but the NBA season is right around the corner. We're only a few weeks away. So it's about that time to start thinking about this upcoming season, previewing it, discussing where teams stack up heading into the 2025-2026 season. So I'll be doing my annual Contender Tiers. I'll be ranking the teams down from 30 all the way up to 1. And so with that said, let's go ahead and get right into it. So in order to preview the upcoming NBA season that kicks off in really about 3 weeks, it is really getting a lot closer than it seems. I'm going to do my annual preseason contender tiers. But in years past, I have taken a little long, if you will, on some of these podcasts to talk about these teams. And so I don't want to feel rushed. I want to give each team their proper due diligence as I talk about them and preview them for this upcoming season. So I'm actually going to make this a series this year. I'm going to have 5 or 6 different podcasts and break the tiers into chunks. So for the episode today, we're going to go in reverse order. So going to start with tier 10. There are 10 total tiers here. I'm calling this tier Pong Ball Hopefuls. And this is the 4 teams that really don't have much interest in winning this season. I think that we could see them tanking by the end of the year, just not putting together overly competitive rosters. They're focusing more on seeing what they have with their young talent, maybe sprinkling a few veterans in there. But ultimately, these teams do not have any inkling of a chance to contend or even remotely close to that. And for the most part, they really don't have much shot to make the playoffs unless something crazy broke their way. And even play-in is probably a push for these teams. So starting out with number 30, the first team in this tier, we have the Utah Jazz. And the Jazz blew things up a few years back by trading Donovan Mitchell and Rudy Gobert. They were a little better than expected directly after that. The team was hanging around the play-in a little bit, but last year was really the first year where they went full tank. They went 17-65, played a lot of young guys, and the roster is even younger this year, at least in terms of who's going to get minutes. They had some veterans over the past few years that, in my opinion, Danny Ainge and this front office overplayed a little bit. They obviously still have Lauri Markkanen, but Colin Sexton, John Collins, Jordan Clarkson, all guys that were kind of mainstays on this roster over the last few years that we had kind of been asking for them to potentially trade for future assets down the road over the past few years. And Danny Ainge is the kind of guy that when he's got a price, if it's not met, then he's not going to settle. But he ended up kind of overplaying it to an extent where John Collins, all they got back was a couple end of the bench veterans and a second round pick. Colin Sexton, they actually had to add draft capital to him to get back Yusuf Nurkic, who was dealt last year with a first-round pick just to get off his contract. And then Jordan Clarkson, they couldn't get any biters on and had to just eventually agree to a buyout, and he's now on the Knicks. So they really recouped absolutely no value for those guys, and I feel like to an extent they're a little bit at risk of doing some of that with Lauri Markkanen as well, who is really the only veteran piece on this team that is at least somewhat of a sure thing. We know what he is. He's made an all-star team to this point. But the reason I say that they might be overplaying it with him too as well is because he had a spectacular first 2 years in Utah. He was close to 24, 25 points a game. He was very nearly 50, 40, 90 over the 2-year span. But last year, he took a pretty significant step back statistics-wise. I mean, his scoring was back under 20 points a game. He actually had the worst field goal percentage and worst three-point percentage of his career last season, so the efficiency took a big hit. You do wonder how much of that has to do with the fact that they were not a very competitive team. So we've seen guys in the past look revitalized and rejuvenated once they get to a more competitive situation. So that could be the case with Markkanen. But the biggest piece here is that he signed a massive contract and is making around $50 million plus now on his new deal. So he's a lot less cheap. He's coming off a down year, and Utah doesn't have much leverage because the clock is ticking. The guy's in his late 20s at this point. So we'll see if they end up dealing him. But whether they do or not, the focus for this team is going to continue to be the youth movement. And the reason I have Utah 30th, whether they're the worst team in the league or not, I think that all the other bottom feeders in the league are in the Eastern Conference, and the East is just a lot easier. The West is so brutal. Like the 15 teams in the West, Utah is legitimately the only one of those 15 that doesn't at least think they can make the playoffs. Whether teams like Sacramento, New Orleans, Phoenix actually can is another discussion, and we will talk about those teams on another episode. But the point is, they're at least trying. They have incentive to be competitive and try to make a push to the playoffs. Utah is really the only team in the West that's not trying to do that. The other 14 are. So that's why I don't see really any path for them to make the plan, let alone be competitive in a playoff push or anything like that, even in the best case scenario. But I think I'm also just a little lower on the Jazz than a lot of other people because I think a lot of their talent is, there's been mixed result on the young talent to this point. And a lot of them, even in their best case project as more role players. But they really do not have that core, like blue chip cornerstone prospect that they feel good about building around. Like the closest thing is probably Ace Bailey, who they took with the 5th pick in this past year's draft. But if you listen to my draft podcast that I did earlier this year, you'd know that I'm not a very big Ace Bailey guy. I'm just not very optimistic that he's going to reach the best case of what he can be just because he's got a lot of red flag type traits. He is a ball stopper on the offensive end of the court. He is a very, very limited playmaker. His shot making, he's lauded with that being his best offensive trait to an extent, but the results weren't really there. He didn't shoot the ball particularly well in college, and a lot of the shots he takes are not good shots. And so I think that he has a lot of learning and developing to do in the areas that are a lot harder to teach. Things like basketball IQ, shot selection, like knowing when to make the right read and what reads to make. Like those are things that he really struggles in. And those are more innate qualities in players typically, which is why I'm not super optimistic of him. I think that he projects as sort of a Michael Porter Jr. type player who, can be a great shot maker, but obviously limited offensively. And in Porter's case, not the best defender. I do think Bailey projects as a little bit of a better defender than Porter, just because I think he's got some good weak side shot blocking ability that I don't know Porter has. But as far as a one-on-one perimeter defender, I still don't think Bailey is some shutdown guy in that end of the court. So I think Ace Bailey's got the highest ceiling of anybody on Utah, but again, it's a lot of unknowns, a lot of we don't know yet. And then you go down the rest of this roster with some of the young guys. Isaiah Collier showed some real promise last year, but the problem with him is that the guy is just a complete non-threat to score. He is a 0 as a shooter. Teams are just not going to defend him out there, despite the fact that he's a very good passer and playmaker, showed flashes there last year. And I do like him. I liked him as a prospect coming out of the draft. But if you can't even have a respectable enough of a shot for teams to go over screens on you, it's going to be really tough for you to be a above average starting point guard in the modern NBA. Then you look at a guy like Keontae George. He has just been an extremely, extremely inefficient player to this point in his career. I sub 40% from the field for his career. His shot has not looked particularly good. The consistency on the offensive end has just been not there at all. I also don't really know what position he is. He's 6'3", 6'4"-ish, so a little small to play full-time 2-guard, but he's not a true point guard. So he's a combo guard in my eyes. I think he's best suited for a role off the bench and sort of the replacement for Jordan Clarkson type role, which maybe he will, thrive there. But again, not a guy that you're going to build a team around. I did like what they got out of Bryce Sensabaugh last season. I thought that he showed some flashes as a really nice role player and shooter. He shot 42% from deep. I think he's probably one of the keepers on this team. But again, I don't see him ever being like a star or even like a high level fringe all-star type player. So again, more of a role guy. Obviously, Walker Kessler has proven to be one of the better shot blockers in the league. I think he's a keeper. But for whatever reason, they seem reluctant to pay him, which I'm not really sure why. But again, even with Kessler, projects as really nothing more than a good defensive anchor and role player. And then you just continue to go down the list. Cody Williams was about as bad as he could have been in his rookie season. I was not a fan of him coming out of the draft, and he shot 32% from the field last year, 26% from three, and he projects as a 3-and-D type player. So if he can't even shoot a respectable clip offensively, then he could be out of the league in short order. Taylor Hendricks showed some flashes, but had an absolutely devastating leg injury last year, so not really sure how he's going to come back from that. And again, not a guy that I view as a star upside type potential player there. And then one other guy who did show some promise last year, Kyle Filipowski. He was a little better than anticipated. He dominated summer league. So could he turn into a nice starting power forward that can play minutes at the 5 in spurts? Sure. He can stretch the floor a little bit, but he struggles as an interior defender, not some elite shot creator or anything like that. So the moral of the story is a lot of their young guys I'm either not a big fan of, or they just don't project as stars, or even like within the realm of someone that could develop into an all-star type player. So to me, they're multiple years into this rebuild. I think they are still multiple years away from really having any sort of chance to take an unexpected leap as an interesting team that could push for the play-in, unless of course they decide to pivot the other way and trade some other assets away to go more win now. But I don't see them doing that. I think they do want to build this thing organically. And it was unfortunate for them that they end up with only the 5th pick in the draft last year. They get a Cooper Flagg, Dylan Harper. Maybe this is a different conversation, but I think Ace Bailey is just way more of an unknown to this point. So for Utah, they are fully in the rebuilding mode, but I still think that they are multiple years away. And among all these bottom feeders, probably the team I feel the least confident can get out of where they are as a rebuilding team in the shortest amount of time. Moving to team number 29, we have the Brooklyn Nets, who came into this offseason with, I think it was 2 guaranteed contracts under full contract. I think it was Nick Claxton and Cam Johnson, and everybody else on the roster was either a two-way player or a free agent to this point. So they had by far the most cap space coming into the summer, but in today's modern NBA, cap space is kind of a lost art. There's not a lot of teams that have that space, and the teams that are typically teams like Brooklyn, which is not exactly the most enticing destination if you're a big name free agent trying to, switch teams. So more often than not, the way stars do it these days is they end up just re-signing with their teams and demanding a trade rather than actually going through the free agency process. We'll see if that ends up changing, because I think teams are adjusting to the new CBA with the salary cap implications of the aprons. So they're being more cognizant of the salary cap. So I think we might see a shift back towards free agency mattering a little bit more, but we're still not there yet. And so Brooklyn, rather than signing a bunch of players, what they did was take advantage of other teams that were looking to get off of contracts and having them attach assets to that. Most notably, they traded away Cam Johnson to get Michael Porter Jr., and as part of that trade, they also got an unprotected 2032 first-round pick from Denver. I think a lot of people were ragging on the Nets for this deal because, Porter's contract is pretty big. He's making $40 million plus, and he's just not proven to be worth that amount of money. So he really is sort of like a negative asset, if you will, given his contract and the type of player that he's been. Not that he's a bad player. He's a good player, but he's a really flawed player. And he really only fits into a box of certain things on the court that he can excel in certain situations. And so to acquire that negative asset on top of the fact that they gave away Cam Johnson, who was on a very, reasonable team-friendly contract in the $25 million-ish range, you'd think that they might be able to get a bit of a haul in that. And so some people thought that just the first-round pick was not enough. But I'm actually going to defend Brooklyn here, because I think for all the talk of all those draft picks that are out there with other teams like Dallas is down the line, Phoenix is, even some future Brooklyn Nets picks that Houston still has. I think this Denver pick is equally as valuable as any of those, if not more valuable, because this is 7 years down the line. Jokic is going to be 37, 38 at this point. I'm not even sure he's still going to be playing in the NBA at that point. And even if he is, he's going to obviously be nowhere near to the level he is now. Denver has also not proven to be a team that's willing to spend. So in the post-Jokic era, you think that they're probably more likely going to try to grow organically like they did the first time around through the draft, which to me says that they probably will bottom out once Jokic is out of the picture. So I think this draft pick has a chance to be like a top 5 pick. I don't know why Denver in 7 years would be not one of the worst teams in the league, assuming Jokic is fully out of the picture at that point, because I just don't see Denver going out and acquiring, some big name to replace him. And they're not going to have been bad enough for long enough to have some new star that they drafted come in unless they get totally lucky, which, they did it with Jokic drafting him in the second round. But unless something like that happens again, I just think it's going to be really difficult for them not to be, a bottom of the league team in 7 years from now. So to me, I thought this was a good, if not great trade for Brooklyn, just like it was for Denver. I thought it was a really good win-win scenario. And Michael Porter Jr., he's going to have 1 year left after this year. So he will be an expiring contract at that point. High value expiring contracts can be pretty valuable assets down the line. So maybe they end up getting to flip him for assets down the line. Not to mention that it's at least interesting to see what he could maybe be as a first option on an NBA team. I don't think it's going to lead to many wins, but he's averaged around 20 points per game as the third option in Denver on really, really efficient shooting. Like he's in the 50, 40, 80 territory basically for his career. And so it's not crazy to think that he could average 23, 24-ish points per game. His efficiency might take a bit of a hit, but even if it does, like he's got such a cushion on what his baseline for efficiency is that even if he, 3% less from the field, 3% less from three, like he's still going to be a relatively efficient player overall. But I do think that there probably will be some ugly moments with him because he just doesn't have the, off the dribble shot creation, the handle to be a prototypical go-to option. I still think he really needs to rely on other people to set him up. And I don't really know who on this Brooklyn roster can do that for him. They did invest quite a bit in playmakers in the draft. They had 5 first-round picks in the 2025 draft, and a lot of people thought they might consolidate those picks. Instead, they end up using every single one of them, which, is most teams can't afford to just add 5 players in the draft. But like I said, they had a million roster spots open, so they were able to do so. They probably just didn't have any deals that they particularly liked. So as a result, they took 5 rookies with those 5 first-round picks, which in theory could have worked really well if they had a really good draft. But I think consensus is that it was really not a very good draft for them. I don't really like anybody that they took. They took Jaeger Demon at number 8 overall, who was projected back into the lottery at earliest. And then they took, used some of these other picks on total projects. Nolan Traore, Ben Seraph, Danny Wolf, who I'm not sure has the athleticism or shot or defense to be an NBA player. They take Drake Powell, who, could be a good 3-and-D guy, had an up and down first year at UNC, but none of those guys are sure things. A lot of them are projects, and I just felt like most of them, particularly in Demon's case, they could have traded back and got him and picked up another asset. I don't think he was going to, go in the top 10 if they didn't take him there. And I also just think I don't love his skill set either. He really, really cannot shoot. He really, really cannot play defense. He's a plus playmaker for his size and position, but not good enough of a ball handler to be like a prototypical point guard in today's NBA. So he strikes me as more of like a playmaking, like hybrid point forward type, but it's going to be really hard for him to stick if he can't defend at that position and he can't shoot at that position. So we'll see. I think his best case is something like a Josh Giddey, but yeah, I think Giddey's a really unique player. Then there's not a lot of other guys like him in the league, and there's a lot of people who are still really skeptical that Giddey, despite the stats he puts up, can be a contributor on a winning team. So I didn't love their draft. I liked the Porter Jr. move. They also added a couple other guys by just, absorbing salary. They got Haywood Highsmith from Miami. They got Kobe Buffkin from Atlanta. They got Terrence Mann also from Atlanta. So I like all those moves, to be honest with you, just because why not? You've got the cap space. I like all those players in some capacity. I think Haywood Highsmith's a good uh, eighth, ninth man role player on a good team. I think Terrence Mann, while he's a little overpaid, can still be similar to Highsmith, a good role player off the bench. Kobe Buffkin, I thought he was interesting coming out of the draft a couple of years ago. He really just has not played, so we don't know what he is. So I kind of like taking a shot on a guy like him who can get some more reps and maybe he can turn into something down the line. But the other biggest storyline for Brooklyn on this offseason was Cam Thomas, and he was a restricted free agent, did not get a deal done with Brooklyn that was satisfactory to him. So he ends up taking the qualifying offer, which means that he will be a unrestricted free agent next offseason. Cam Thomas is, a fun player. He can drop 30 to 40 points on any given night, but I still don't really know what his destiny is as a player in the NBA. I worry that he is at his best in, the role he's in with Brooklyn, which is just a guy who can score 25 points on a 20-win team that really is not anywhere close to being any sort of competitive. I just don't know. Similar to what I said about Keontae George, I don't know what position he plays. He's not a true point guard. He made some strides as a playmaker last year, but he really is such a black hole offensively. He just isn't where he needs to be in terms of making reads offensively and making the right pass and being a connective piece. He's a little too ball hoggy, ball stoppery, but he's undersized to play the two, and he's a mess defensively. And so I don't know what his destiny is. I think that ultimately he's probably best suited, if we're talking about a competitive team, for like a Lou Williams type role when he was in his prime, which there could be a spot for him in the NBA. But I do worry because those types of players are being phased out a little bit in terms of value across the NBA. Like Jordan Clarkson, I know he's in his 30s, past his prime, but was winning Sixth Man of the Year. And then Utah, when they were trying to sell high on him, couldn't even get any biters for him and had to just release him. Another Utah guy, Colin Sexton. A lot of people like him and thought that he could be a good six man off the bench. But, we just saw they had to attach assets to him just to get Yusuf Nurkic back. So I just worry that archetype of player is sort of a dying breed. The like spark plug combo guard scorer off the bench that doesn't play much defense. I think it works in the regular season, but come playoff time, those guys tend to get phased out of the rotation a little bit more. At least their minutes take a little bit of a hit there. So overall, this roster is bad. Any offense led by Michael Porter Jr. and Cam Thomas is going to be an interesting one, to say the least. A lot of shots getting chucked up, not a lot of playmaking, which I know they tried to emphasize in the draft, but I'm not sure how ready any of those guys are going to be. The only thing that I really particularly like about this roster is Nick Claxton. I still think he is a very underrated player in the NBA. We saw what he looked like when he had a competent roster and offensive playmakers around him as a rim running big. And I still think he is highly, highly versatile as a defender that can guard on the perimeter at the center position and also still a really good shot blocker. So I think that if I was a team out there that could use an extra center, I would go out and try to get Nick Claxton. He's got a reasonable deal. I think it's in the $25 million range, which isn't awful, especially for a starting center. I feel like that's pretty market value there. So I think Claxton, I like him, but he's the kind of guy that's really not going to shine on a roster like this. He's going to be at his best when he's around star players and in more of a winning situation. So Brooklyn, like Utah, going to be very, very bad. They were actually a little better than people expected last year, 26 wins, but I think they're going to be worse than last year. They had more veterans to start the year last year with guys like Dennis Schroeder that were able to elevate them a little bit. I think this year it's going to be a lot of Michael Porter Jr. and Cam Thomas on offense, not a lot on defense overall. And then a lot of these rookies, I'm not sure they're going to be able to make the impact that Brooklyn hopes they can, at least not as early as this season. Up next at number 28, we have the Washington Wizards, who again are entering year 3 of their rebuild post the Bradley Beal era in Washington, where they were, around 500, very mediocre for many years on end. But 15 wins 2 years ago, 18 last year. I do think that they are a team that could be capable of taking a little bit of a leap. I think Brooklyn and Utah's outlook for this year is pretty bleak. I'm not sure I see either of them winning more than 25 games in really any scenario this year. Washington, I think, at least has enough pieces where it wouldn't shock me if they got, close to around 30 wins. I think that they have a nice mix of veterans, which the other teams do too, but the veterans on this team actually could be useful. Chris Middleton, they add CJ McCollum in the offseason as well. Like, those are two proven players that I'm not sure are totally completely washed. I think Middleton, the injuries have made it tough on his career, but when he has played, he's still been pretty solid across the board on both ends. And then McCollum, has been a 20 plus point per game scorer for multiple years now. So I don't see why he wouldn't continue to do that, especially with increased responsibility and opportunity on this team. But it's less about the veterans and more about the young guys. I think that Washington has at least a couple guys that I could see turning into, legitimate high level starter, maybe potential all stars down the road, which the previous two teams just did not. The top two guys that I think could make the biggest impact or get to that point on this roster, one is Trey Johnson, who was their first round pick in this year's draft, the sixth overall pick out of Texas. I really, really like Trey. He's got good size. He is an elite movement shooter. He can shoot off the dribble as well. He's just a bucket getter. The guy can flat out score. I think he was pushed into a little bit too much of a ball dominant role in college, which I'm not sure if that's his ultimate destiny. I think he will thrive as an off-ball player as well, but he just wasn't on a good enough team with other guards that could set him up in college. And so I think playing with a guy like CJ McCollum, even a young guy like Bub Carrington, who's a little bit more pass first, will do wonders for him. And I think that his efficiency should take a jump because of that. But he fits into today's NBA. A guy that's 6'5", got good size at his position, and can just shoot the hell out of the ball from anywhere on the court. And I think he's just going to be a 18 to 20 point per game scorer as soon as year two. And I wouldn't even be shocked if he's in the 17, 18 points per game range as a rookie this season. I think he really could be that good. And I do like him as a guy that, is he going to be, an all NBA level player? Obviously impossible to say this early. I'm not necessarily expecting that, but I think he in his prime could be a 25 plus point per game guy. And that's normally good enough to, at least get you in the conversation for an all-star game. So I like Trey Johnson a lot. He's still super young. He's a one and done freshman this past year. So he's going to take some time to polish his game, but I at least see the vision with him as a guy that could be a leading scorer on a playoff team. The other guy is Alex Sarr, who I had mixed feelings on him coming out of the draft last year. Obviously, it was a weaker draft in 2024, but he did show some real flashes. He very much impressed as a shot blocker and was at least a willing three-point shooter, 5 attempts a game. He only shot 31% from there. But again, he's super young. That shot could come around. If he can get it up to league average type level, then I think that's going to open up a lot of things for him offensively. I would like to see him be more efficient in the paint. He shot sub 40% from the field as a 7-foot rookie, which is not ideal, but I think a lot of that is shot selection. I think he was too jump shot happy. He took 5 threes compared to only 7 twos per game. I'd like to see that a little less, closer to 50-50. I think he needs to get bigger, bulkier, more willing to bang down low in the paint, because he's got a ton of size and he's a good athlete. So I do think he has more potential there. But look, if he's a guy that's going to be able to block close to 2 shots a game, he's going to be able to stretch the floor, and he's got the size, length, athleticism that he has a lot of upside. I'm still not totally convinced on him as like a sure thing. There were questions about his motor and things like that coming out of the draft, which always scares me a little bit. We've seen plenty of guys like a DeAndre Ayton, for example, that have all the talent and the physical attributes that you could want out of a star center, but then when they don't put that extra effort and will to win into their game, it just they bounce around the league and become very untrustworthy and lackluster as a player. So I'm not certain that Sarr won't end up being one of those scenarios. Also, I need to see some better efficiency. Like, you just cannot shoot 40% or 39%, whatever he was last year, as a 7-footer in today's NBA. It's just, that is completely just unacceptable for a guy of that size. I mean, even from 2, he was only 45% in 2-point range. So he needs to improve his finishing. He needs to take better shots. But I think if he's going to make those strides, a lot of that could get worked out this year, because I think he's going to have more reliable ball handlers around him. Like, CJ McCollum is just a professional guard in the NBA. He's going to be able to get him better looks in more comfortable spots on the court for him. Even Chris Middleton is a guy who can run the pick and roll. We saw him, in his prime be spectacular there with Giannis. I'm sure they can do a little bit of the same here in Washington. And Trey Johnson, I think, is going to take some pressure off of Sarr as a guy that they have to guard in the perimeter, who can do a little bit of playmaking. So I think with the improved ball handling around him and playmaking, I think there's room for Sarr to be a little bit more efficient as soon as this coming year. But he needs to take a leap there, because I'm not sure. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I can only imagine there's not that many 7-footers who've shot under 40% from the field. And big men in today's NBA need to be efficient, or else they're not going to be playable. And then outside of those two, they do have some other interesting pieces. They traded for Cam Whitmore in the offseason as a sort of a salary dump from Houston. They got AJ Johnson last year from the Bucks in the Kuzma trade. He played significantly better in an expanded role with Washington last year, so he's certainly an interesting piece. They still have Bilal Coulibaly, who I'm less bullish on. I wasn't a huge fan coming out of the draft, and he looked really bad in the Euro League this past summer. And, I just have not seen the strides offensively out of him I would have liked going into year 3 now. They add Malachi Branham, Blake Wesley, both from San Antonio. So, they're doing a lot of what Brooklyn did, just taking in younger talent from other teams that, are trying to dump guys, give them more opportunities. So I like those moves. They draft Will Riley in the first round as well, along with Trey Johnson, as I mentioned. And so, look, I don't even know what this rotation is going to look like. I don't know if Middleton and McCollum are going to start. I don't know if they're going to finish games. I think they will, at least to begin the year, play a good amount. I think those two could be trade chips for them down the road. I think their salaries are tradable. They certainly could help a contending team in some capacity, in some role. But like Cam Whitmore, I think it's worthwhile to see what he has. I think he is underratedly one of the biggest black holes and ball stoppers we have in the league. But it would be hard to know, because he just didn't play that much in Houston. So I think an expanded role there will be good for him. They still have guys like Corey Kispert, Bub Carrington, who I touched on, Keyshawn George. They have a lot of options, a lot of young guys that, if all they need is 1 or 2 of those lesser prospects to turn into useful role players, and then one of Trey Johnson and Alex Sarr to turn into the star they hope they can be, and then they're at least headed in the right direction. So Washington, a little bit more interesting than Brooklyn and Utah in terms of I think they could be a little better this year than they were the last couple years. As I said, it wouldn't shock me if they're in the 30-win range. Wouldn't shock me if they at least flirted with the play-in this season a little bit, but I do not see them really having any shot at the playoffs, for example. But I think if you're a Wizards fan, you have to feel pretty good just in the fact that this rebuild is moving in the right direction. Like I said, with Utah and Brooklyn as well, they don't have the blue chip prospect. They are still multiple years away from getting to the point where they can be a competitive, interesting team, or if they make some big transaction that I don't see happening. But with Washington, I think if they make a little bit of strides this year and then hit on their lottery pick next year too, they could have a really, really nice core that in a year or two we're talking about as a sleeper playoff team, for example. So, but we will see, because it is going to be pretty contingent on the development of a lot of their young guys, which obviously is never a sure thing, and hence why they are still ranked 28th in the rankings here. And then the last team in this tier that we have, the Ping Pong Ball Hopefuls in tier 10, is the Charlotte Hornets at number 27. And for anyone who listened to my preseason picks and podcast last year, I was actually a little bullish on the Hornets. I thought that they could be a play-in team last year. I liked a lot of the pieces they had. But that could not have been further from what happened. They end up winning only 19 games last season in what was a bit of a disaster season for them. LaMelo Ball plays only 47 games. Brandon Miller plays only 27 games. Mark Williams plays only 44 games. Trey Mann only 13 games. So they were decimated by injuries quite a bit. So it's a little unfair to judge their full product based on that. But the problem is a lot of these guys and their injury issues are not a one-time unique thing. LaMelo, as I said, 47 games last year, only 22 the year before, only 36 the year before that. So he has not reached the 50-game mark in 3 years. Even his rookie season, he only played 51 games. So he's played above 51 once in his 5-year career. And it's been a big issue for him. But I don't really know what to do with the Hornets because I feel like they were trending in the right direction. I am a LaMelo Ball defender. I'm a LaMelo Ball believer, whether I should be or not. I think that his talents and skill set as a passer, a playmaker, he's a guy that typically makes the right reads. He's obviously shot happy at times, but he is, genuinely pass first in general. And I just think those are the kind of traits that are really hard to come by for a high volume, high usage guard in today's NBA. I think he is a tremendous shot maker. He's not an efficient player by any means, but I think a lot of that has to do with the shot selection. I think he takes bad shots. I think that he settles. I think he's a showman. He likes to take the difficult shot and then makes it at maybe a slightly higher clip than the average player so he can justify continuing it. But I just feel like if he was in a situation with good defensive pieces around him, with a winning culture, someone who held him accountable to the types of shots that he takes, then I really do believe that he could be a high-level contributor, all-star level player on a playoff team. And we saw a little bit of that early in his career. He made the play-in his first 2 seasons, and he was the lead guy in both those teams. He finished above 500 one year. Like, the proof of concept at least has been there, but it has not come to fruition. A lot of it has to do with health. But again, a lot of it just is innately who LaMelo appears to be. But I really do feel like the talent's there, and I do think a lot of the things that weigh him down can be coached out of him. So we'll see that. I don't know if that's ever going to happen in Charlotte, or maybe a change of scenery needs to happen with a franchise that he's got less history with, and they haven't maybe coddled him as much as the Hornets have, or maybe just a better roster situation. But between having a guy like LaMelo and then drafting Brandon Miller, who I was wrong about, I thought he was going to be a bust coming out. And I mean, it's still early. Like, he's no sure thing as like a future high level starter, all-star type guy, but he's looked really good as a rookie. And last year, like I said, very injury prone. He was inefficient, 40% from the field. But he took 11 threes a game last year at 36%. So like, he's a guy that can shoot the hell out of the ball for his size and position. He can, dabble as a shot creator, work in the isolation. He's got size. He's, in theory, could be a good, long, athletic defender. He can operate in the mid-range if they allow him to do that a little bit more. So, like, Brandon Miller is certainly a kind of guy that you'd feel good about building your team around at this stage in his career. Then they draft Con Knippel, who I really like coming out of the draft. I think he is a winning type player, the kind of guy who always makes the right read, who doesn't take bad shots, who's a elite 3-point shooter, who can underratedly operate and hit out of the mid-range as well. He, finished a lot better than I would have expected in the paint in college as well. Like, he's just a connective piece and the kind of piece that I think this roster really needs. So I think that'll help. And then I really liked Mark Williams personally. I still think he can be a very, very good, useful starting center in the NBA. He's huge. He's got good shooting touch. And he's a good rebounder. Defensively, he's not always the most engaged, but he has at least the physical attributes to, in theory, be pretty good there. And he's proven that he can be at least a very productive offensive player at the center position. But then they trade him away. And I get it with the health concerns, but they're going into this season now with, I guess, Mason Plumlee as the starting center. Maybe Diabate, he's a little undersized, but looked decent last year. They draft Kalkbrenner out of Creighton in the second round this year. So I'm just like, I don't know what they're doing. I liked where they were going and the direction and the pieces they were building, but then you trade away Mark Williams, and then you continue to make these deals where you're just kind of asset hoarding, and it's giving me mixed signals because I feel like LaMelo is good enough and is getting old enough into his prime where they should be thinking about adding and going for it and trying to make the playoffs and building around Mark Williams and Brandon Miller and Con Knipple and LaMelo Ball and making a push because they've been so bad for so long and they've got a lot of talent. Like, this is a talented roster, much more so than the other three teams in this tier. But the problem is I don't feel like they want to win, and I don't think they know what they want to do. And so the question for me is if they're going to keep trading away, core pieces like Mark Williams and just asset hoarding, then I don't really understand why they're holding on to LaMelo. Because at his age and his talent, he's the kind of guy that at this point you'd want to start moving chips into the center of the table to make a push, and they just don't appear to want to do that. So I don't know if that says something about LaMelo Ball. I don't know if the front office is just indecisive on that front. But it felt like they were in a rebuild. They were adding good pieces and then just decided to basically enter like a second rebuild in the middle of their rebuild, which I just don't get it. I really don't. So this team, I like a lot of what they had. Like I've said, I wish they had a better center right now other than the names I mentioned previously, because I think Mark Williams would fit well on this team. They have some other interesting role players, Grant Williams coming back from his injury, Miles Bridges I didn't mention, but he's been a, productive scorer for this team for really the majority of his career. They still have Josh Green. They did add Colin Sexton, as I mentioned. They have Trey Mann, so they've got a lot of interesting scoring options. They shot a ton of threes last year in Charles Lee's system, but defensively, I just don't know where they're going to get the level of play there that they need to be able to compete. They have no rim protection whatsoever. They may not even have a NBA level center on the roster. And then they've just got a lot of guys that are one-way players, particularly on the offensive end. I think when they drafted Tijan Salon last year, they thought he could turn into a defensive type player, but I'm not even sure that guy's an NBA player. I was not a fan coming out of the draft, and he just looks lost out there. He's a zero on offense. He's not always in the right spots defensively. I'm not sure he's going to stick, but he better make some strides this year, else he's going to look like he's certainly headed towards being a bust. And so, with Charlotte, again, would I be shocked if they were in the plan? I wouldn't, because I thought they had the talent to do it last year. They have mostly the same talent outside of the center position. But again, I just don't really know what their plan is. I could have put them in the tier ahead of this as well, but I put them in this bottom tier because I don't think they want to win. I don't think this front office is attempting to be competitive because of the moves they're making. It is contradictory to the idea that they are making a push with LaMelo to make the playoffs. So I did put them in this bottom tier, and the results just haven't been there too. So I think this is an important season for them. If they can get back in that 35 win range, then I think they might start to add, maybe they go out and get a Nick Claxton or, some more defensive minded players. And then they're not that far off from being a competitive play-in team. But if LaMelo gets hurt again, they only win in the mid 20s or something like that, then I really think they need to start at least thinking about having a conversation about which direction they want to pick, because they either need to invest in the roster around LaMelo Ball and Brandon Miller and Con Knipple, or they need to just enter phase 2 of this rebuild, because they're kind of sitting in the middle a little bit right now. And I think that they've got enough talent where if they made some investment, then they could be interesting. But they also have shown that they're more interested in asset hoarding right now. So we'll see with Charlotte. But they are the last team in this tier because I really do think that they ultimately are eyeing the lottery and not so much this season. And that's going to do it for this episode of the Sean Jones NBA Show. As I mentioned, this is going to be a series. that I'll be releasing over the next few weeks up until the season starts. So in the next episode, I will discuss Tier 9, and we'll just continue to go from there as we get down to the top contenders in the league. So thank you so much for listening, and I will chat with you soon.